Welcome, and thank you for joining us here in Williamsburg. My name is Mike Tierney. I'm the director of William & Mary's Global Research Institute. And let me start by saying it is so nice to be having in-person conferences again. I returned to the United States last night, having spent the previous 6 days at a conference and a series of meetings in Crete. It was very, very tough work to meet in Crete, but somebody had to volunteer to do it, and I got the short straw. I'm still questioning my decision to return home, especially when I was on 95 South yesterday. But in my time at the ISA meetings in Greece, they caused me to reflect on the purpose and function of in-person meetings like this. These are really important catalysts for high-quality research at any university. We can accomplish many great things on Zoom and over email, but it's very hard to replicate the learning that takes place in face-to-face interactions. And I'm not just talking about the interactions during the formal panel sessions, which are very important. I'm talking about the wide-ranging conversations that take place over coffee, over dinner, and over beer as a source of inspiration and as the foundation for long-term collaborative research partnerships. I'm hopeful that this meeting will accomplish these goals, and it will be the first of many future convenings that you attend here in the Berg. William & Mary's Global Research Institute is home to 10 student faculty research labs. All 10 of the labs are committed to engaging practitioners in government, private, and the nonprofit sectors to address real-world problems. When I look at the participant list for this meeting, I'm optimistic about the prospects for collaboration between university researchers and practitioners of many different stripes. ADATA is the largest lab at GRI and has done so much to advance our knowledge about the causes and effects of China's development finance, its foreign policy, and the prospects for cooperation. What stands out to me about the approach that ADATA has taken over the past 10 years is the transparency of its methods and its openness to criticism, and its willingness to take that criticism seriously, revise its methods based on that type of input. ADATA has been open to engagement with scholars from multiple different disciplines, with practitioners from the private and NGO sectors, and with policymakers in Washington, in Nairobi, and I think especially important, in Beijing. I trust this meeting will provide us with another opportunity to improve our data, methods, and our understanding of multiple different perspectives on these important questions. I'd now like to turn the microphone over to my boss, Provost Peggy Agouris. Peggy is originally from Greece, so she knows that my earlier threat to just stay in Crete forever is not completely hollow. Peggy is the chief academic officer at William & Mary. If you're not in academia, you may not know what a provost is, but think sort of highest level academic administrator. But as important from my point of view, she is an exceptionally accomplished scholar who understands what a university needs if it is going to do research of consequence at scale. Provost Agouris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you at William & Mary, and as its Chief Academic Officer, it is a double pleasure to see that we have a thriving group of eager participants in an in-person meeting that has been long in the making. So thank you for being here. This convening will explore the implications of China's global rise. And as we seek to make sure that democracy remains a reality worldwide, it is up to all of us to develop a mutual understanding of the pressing challenges that we face. Before we go any further, though, I would like to thank the team who convened this group. ADATA Director of Policy Analysis, Sam Custer. Executive Director, Brad Parks. Senior Research Scientist, Amar Malik. And the Director of GRI, Mike Tierney. Thank you all. Planning, yes. Planning for a conference of this scale required months of efforts, and considering where we were a while ago, you can understand the extent of these efforts. So I would like to also recognize the team that designed this event: Ryan Musto, Emily Drummond, Cassie Keene, and Rebecca Ladurell. So thinking about it, this conference comes at a very important time. We're hearing that the era of great power competition is back, which begs the question, is contested cooperation still possible? China's Belt and Road Initiative is entering its 10th year of implementation. At the same time, there are increasing questions about the costs and benefits of Chinese development projects and Beijing's intent. And the West seems ready to respond. Here at William and Mary, or as we are known, the alma mater of the nation, we are positioned to lead in local, national, and global conversations to uphold the democratic ideals in the 21st century. William and Mary is elevating our collective commitment to supporting and sustaining democracy as a cornerstone of our Vision 2026 strategic plan, which is not something that emerged lightly. There was a lot of thought and a lot of effort to capture where we are as global environment and also as a local and academically well-known entity. All of us in this room have witnessed the pressing threats to democracy worldwide. False narratives, disinformation have eroded trust in institutions and media, which actually means that we cannot debate constructively if we do not share facts. Over the next few days, we will share the results of rigorous research, data, and evidence. We aim to catalyze dialogue, to create shared understanding, even as we recognize the proposed policy solutions will differ. This discourse is elevated by the work of AData, a premier research lab founded and nurtured here at William and Mary. Like many of you, AData is addressing critical questions to understand, such as why developing countries are eager to work with China. What are the impacts of China's spending on U.S. foreign policy? And the opportunities for the U.S. to respond to the interests of people in countries across the economic development spectrum. U.S. and Western leaders must chart a course to engage with China as lender, donor, influencer, and global power, and do so in a way that safeguards the liberal international order and the interests of developing countries. At the same time, we need to understand the local impacts of China's spending and its attempts to influence countries that are not great powers. That is the human side of our research. AData is poised to lead in this work. There's a volume of work behind AData and a lot of emerging significant directions that are very critical. Future research agendas will seek solutions to help countries that receive China's loans strengthen their accountability systems in order to effectively manage public debt. The questions you will explore in the coming days are critical, and I don't want to preempt that. I'm just thinking with you. Are windows still open for closer cooperation with China, landing in areas of common interest? How best can a commitment to democracy be assured, given China's global rise? What does the future hold for the liberal international order? Will China be a partner or a threat? The West and China do well to address problems that necessitate collective action, such as robust economic development, issues of global public health, and environmental sustainability. All this to say, William and Mary is proud to host this convening and grateful for your participation. Over the coming days, we hope that this assembly of experts can work together towards potential solutions. Thank you for being here, and thank you in advance for your valuable thoughts and participation in this event. It is now my pleasure to introduce William and Mary's Chancellor and alumnus, the Honorable Robert M. Gates, who joins us by video greeting.
It's a pleasure to be with you all today, if only virtually. William & Mary has a remarkable history of contributing to the nation. Though small, we punch way above our weight. Over the past few years, William & Mary has become a global hotspot for policy-relevant China research. Our work here has become a cornerstone, informing the nation's citizens and policymakers alike. Since 2021, Aid Data's China research has provided a foundation for understanding China's global influence. Its work has been cited often by The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and many others. Multiple agencies of the U.S. government, as well as governments and think tanks abroad, rely on Aid Data's work. Aid Data has sparked intense debate among policymakers and local media across the globe, from here at home to Europe, Uganda, Pakistan, India, Indonesia, and many others. All of this stems from the old colonial capital. On campus, Aid Data brings together a large team of faculty, professional staff, and students. Since 2007, Aid Data and the larger Global Research Institute have trained and employed over 1,000 students, all passionate to make a difference. This conference extends and builds on Aid Data's momentum. Over today and tomorrow, you will discuss China's growing global influence, the implications for countries on the receiving end of its initiatives, and the possible responses by the United States and our allies. The conference will showcase cutting-edge research documenting China's influence playbook and will stimulate dialogue for practical action. The conference is organized around 3 tracks: development, influences on local domestic politics, and contested cooperation between the United States and China. As China continues to grow its influence, the information presented today and the discussions here will contribute to a better and more realistic understanding of the challenges posed by China and how other nations can respond to protect their sovereignty and ensure peaceful competition. I wish you all the best as you engage in this work.
After Prime Minister Rudd's remarks, we will kick off the conference with our first keynote conversation, entitled Reimagining U.S. Economic Statecraft in an Era of Contested Cooperation with China. Joining us will be Ms. Carly Fiorina, Ambassador Jason Chung, and Pakistan's Senator Mushaid Hussain Syed. Simon Rabinovich, U.S. economics editor for The Economist, will moderate the conversation. I look forward to learning from these practitioners who bring diverse perspectives to this topic, and I especially look forward to an exciting 2 days talking with you. For, I think, our final video conversation here in the next hour, Prime Minister Rudd, I turn it over to you.
It's good to be with you at the William and Mary China convening, which you've intriguingly entitled Separating Fact from Fiction. That's an important intellectual discipline to have in mind when we seek to undertake an objective analysis of what's going on in China and what are the underlying dynamics in the US-China relationship. It's for those reasons that I wrote this book entitled The Avoidable War, because I am concerned deeply about the objective facts alive in the US-China relationship and this whole world of subjective perception, which is equally alive in the US-China relationship. If we go to the facts first, or let's call them the objective and measurable facts, One of the key dynamics underpinning the changing structure and reality of US-China relations is the change in the balance of power. Militarily, economically, technologically, China is becoming a major global power. In its competitive race against the United States, China sees itself as being in a position to overtake the United States in each of these three categories at some point over the next 20 to 30 years. Militarily, it has a judgment that in East Asia and the West Pacific, right now, China may well be already in the ascendant. And for those reasons, it brings into sharp relief the dynamics underpinning the US-China relationship over Taiwan and continuing frictions in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. That's where objective strategic facts take us. Of course, based on those facts, however loosely, there then emerges a whole new world of subjective strategic perception. And if I read carefully the Chinese ideological and political literature internally, what it points to is Xi Jinping and those around him having increased national political confidence in China's underlying military and economic and technological strength, that it can now begin to assert its presence much more decisively across the region and the world. Previous Chinese leaders, such as Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao, were quite explicit about the relationship between China's material power on the one hand and its ability to project that power on the other. It seems like common sense, but not necessarily in a world of international relations. What Xi Jinping has done, however, is reached a conclusion that now China's aggregate national power, or the term they use, comprehensive national power, 综合国力, is of an order of magnitude that China can now assert its interests and its values into the regional and international order. These are critical underpinnings for the dynamics that now characterize the US-China strategic relationship. For these reasons, it is, in my argument, a relationship of strategic competition, where the prize is the dominant power to become or to remain the dominant power militarily, economically, and strategically, and technologically by mid-century. So it is a race. The question I have for the decade ahead, which in my book I describe as the decade of living dangerously, is whether this strategic competition between China and the US is in fact unmanaged strategic competition with the rolling risk of crisis, escalation, conflict, and war of the type we saw, for example, in World War I, or whether it's better for Beijing and Washington to spend some time beginning to identify the principles which might underpin managed strategic competition as an alternative. The argument of my book is that it's far better to look at managed strategic competition, basic guardrails in a relationship, rules of the road. I argue that there should be three underlying principles. Number one, in the strategic red lines which currently characterize this relationship around Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, and cyber and space. But rather than this game of push and shove, which is potentially destabilizing on any day of the week, it's far better for each side to articulate through high-level diplomacy to each other what the fundamental strategic red lines of each side are, so that if they are crossed, then it is known in advance that there will be a retaliatory action of one form or another. On balance, I believe that is more stabilizing as a set of principles than invisible arrangements at present, which lead to the dynamics of push and shove and always the ever-present danger of overreach. The second element of managed strategic competition is that if we can get the first principle right about strategic red lines, it does enable the relationship to then engage in non-lethal strategic competition across the rest of security policy, the rest of foreign policy, the rest of economic policy, and the technological race which currently is ongoing between the two sides, but also the ideational debate between China's concept of Marxist-Leninist nationalism, or as they would say it, Marxist-Leninist internationalism, against the idea of an international liberal institutionalist or liberal capitalist order that the United States has led by and large since the end of the Second World War, and certainly since the end of the Cold War. The third element, and the final element of this argument about managed strategic competition, is that if you can get the strategic red lines battened down to the extent that's possible to reduce the risk of inadvertent crisis, if you can proceed with non-lethal strategic competition across the rest of the relationship, you can still carve out a third area through political and diplomatic capital being deployed for those areas of continued strategic cooperation and collaboration where it's in the national interests of both Beijing and Washington to do so. Climate change is the obvious candidate. Global financial stability is a less obvious candidate, but myself having been Prime Minister of Australia during the global financial crisis, in my argument, essential. But also handling the next global public health crisis, because I'm sure the pandemic, which we collectively screwed up so badly on most recently, won't be the last global public health crisis we have to deal with in the decade ahead. In a nutshell, they're the three elements of managed strategic competition, and it can only be done by a group of dedicated high-level officials in Beijing and Washington who are dedicated to this task. I'm encouraged to see there are some signs emerging both from Beijing and Washington, literally in the last few weeks, that there is more of a political and institutional appetite for moving in this direction towards what I describe as a stabilization of the relationship as opposed to a normalization of the relationship. Anyway, that's why I've written what I've written in this book. And more importantly, for those of you gathered at William and Mary, this important William and Mary China convening, or convening on China, that you and your collective deliberations can also work hard on separating fact from fiction as we try to wrap our minds and our policy advice to the governments of both China and the United States in order to navigate this decade of living dangerously which lies ahead. Because it's my view, and I think the view of most sober-minded citizens, that this war, in fact, should be an entirely avoidable one and remain that way.
Wherever you want to sit.
You have you're the moderator.
I'll be on the side. Yeah.
Good morning.
Morning. Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. This panel is flagrantly in violation of the business casual dress code. I was going to take my tie off if their ties were off, so I put the blame on them.
Wearing a white shirt.
Not on this arena. You know, there's already been some great introductions to today's proceedings. Let me just say that, you know, reading through the preamble to the conference, I was struck by one of the lines that Samantha and her team put together. They talked about the idea that the ideological polarization is exacerbated by imperfect information on what the PRC is doing today. And I think one of the great values of aid data and the work they do is helping to be a corrective to some of that imperfect information, specifically on the question of what is China doing with its external financing, with its loans and aid programs for the rest of the world, especially the developing world. And I can tell you that at The Economist, where I'm currently U.S. economics editor, previously for the past nearly decade, I was the China economics editor based in Shanghai and part of the time in Beijing as well. I drew regularly on the work of aid data. You know, most recently last year, they had a great report where they tallied up something like 13,427 different foreign financing projects that China has been involved in, roughly $800 billion in total loans. Nearly half of that was deemed to be hidden debt. So I can say that my participation in today's panel is partly because I feel I owe a debt to aid data. It's not a hidden debt. I'm very transparent about it, all the contributions of their work for mine over the years. So it's great to be here. The topic of the panel is reimagining U.S. economic statecraft in an era of contested cooperation with China, before we kind of delve into that and delve into the panelists, I thought I would just give a very, very quick overview of, why we are where we are. I think as everybody in the room knows, coming out of the Second World War, the US obviously was the prime architect of the international economic order, of the Bretton Woods institutions. China, throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s was effectively a world apart, on the sidelines, not a part of that. Beginning with China's reform and opening up in the late 1970s through the 1980s, of course, China began to integrate itself into the global international economic order. US policy was predicated throughout those decades on the idea of engagement. And as China got bigger, when it finally joined the WTO in 2001, I think the core underlying principle of US economic policy vis-a-vis China was summed up best of all by Bob Zoellick when he talked about the idea of trying to make China a responsible stakeholder. Well, you fast forward to where we are today, and if you look at all of the different dimensions of China's economic power, it's clear that it's gone beyond being a stakeholder. Really China is now a power broker. If you survey roughly 190 different countries, more than 130 of them trade more with China than they do with the US. If you look at China's aid profile, China gives more in aid. The outstanding stock of China's aid portfolio is larger than the World Bank's. If you look at trade deals, so what actually are the rules of international trade? Well, just focusing on Asia for 1 second, of course, for a time, the US was trying to be very present. It was the driving force behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It withdrew from that. Effectively, the rule of trade order in Asia has been we're okay there?
We're okay.
Has been ceded to China. If you look at the RCEP, China didn't initiate it, but China helped to bring it over the finishing line. Now you have the US trying to re-engage itself in trade in Asia with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. They can't even call it a trade deal. They call it an economic framework because they're aware that domestically there isn't a constituency to push forward that kind of trade arrangement. So China is no longer just a stakeholder. It's a power broker. Is it responsible? Well, I think that question raises a question in and of itself, which is, given to a certain extent US retrenchment from the world and specifically from Asia, is it even within the rights of the US to say whether or not China is responsible? That, as far as Beijing is concerned, is their own parameter. That's their own call to make. So I think in the panel today, we're going to hopefully discuss is how big a threat is China's rise? How can the US respond to it? What kind of tools of statecraft does it have at its disposal to deal with the rising Chinese challenge? It's a very esteemed panel, so much so that I'm just going to go by alphabetical order in introducing everybody because I don't know who's senior and who's less senior. So starting on the far left, we have Jason Chung, Ambassador Jason Chung. For several years in the Trump administration, he led the US mission to the Asian Development Bank based in Manila. He also, for a time, was Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Treasury Department, and he spent many years in the trenches on Capitol Hill as well. So a lot of political, diplomatic, and administrative experience. To my immediate left, Carly Fiorina, who I think probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll provide one nonetheless. Former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, a long career in politics, including as a candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 2016. I like to think that the world would be in a very different place if you had succeeded, but we are where we are. And she's drawn on her ample experience and expertise in industry and politics to provide advice to the government over the years, including as chair of the CIA's External Advisory Board. And then in the middle, last but not least, is Senator Mushahid Hussain, member of parliament in Pakistan, currently the chair of the Senate Defense Committee. Also still chair of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor committee as well, so a lot of expertise on Pakistani-Chinese relations. Also a founder of the first think tank in Pakistan that was devoted to Chinese-Pakistani relations. And I think I'm on fairly safe ground saying that he's also the only person in this room to have personally had the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence Friendship Award bestowed upon him by Xi Jinping back in 2015. So he's definitely going to bring a different perspective to the conversation. Now we have a lot of time ahead of us, nearly an hour and a half. We're going to start with a structured, moderated conversation for nearly an hour, and then we'll open up the floor. I thought, given that it is quite a long time, it would be useful to structure the conversation. So broadly speaking, going to break it into 3 different sections. Going to start off with a general discussion of the principles, both on the American but also the Chinese side that might underlie this discussion. Then look a little bit more at the Chinese challenge, the parameters of it. And then lastly, look at the American response. So being that we're at a university, I'm sure many of you remember writing essays at university, and the first thing that you always do when the question is posed to you is that you kind of get into the definitional discussion of what exactly is the question, what exactly are these terms. So I want to start with, and this is for everybody on the panel, we're talking about U.S. economic statecraft. Before looking at the actual tools, I want to understand a little bit what you see as kind of the why of U.S. economic statecraft. What exactly should the U.S. be trying to achieve? Is it a question of principle, trying to underwrite the liberal international order? Is it a question of power, projection of power? What exactly is the U.S. trying to achieve? Do you want to start, Ambassador Chung?
Sure. Call me Jason. I like to say Ambassador Chung is my father, but that's what my kids say. So I think the purpose of U.S. economic statecraft is pure and large economic. It's to take developing countries, provide them for ample opportunities to move up kind of like this economic value chain, pure and simply. I think the other thing about the U.S. economic statecraft, and I know we're going to get into this later, but it's transparent. It provides, you know what you're going to get when you engage with the United States. We have several representatives from the U.S. government here, and they understand what I'm talking about. But as you see, there are challenges with that. The U.S. government is not the fastest moving organization on earth, right? And I think that poses a challenge for what we try to do when we highlight some of the opportunities of doing work with the United States. I think not only from a government perspective, but you also have from a corporate perspective. And I think Ms. Fiorina can speak to that a little bit more. But from a corporate perspective, you have an opportunity to have like our corporate interest, which could bring up kind of like this value chain in economic development and so on and so forth within developing countries as well.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Fiorina.
So I want to begin with what Prime Minister Rudd said, because I think, among other things, what the Prime Minister was encouraging was a strategic view, clarity, and consistency. And I think all 3 of those things are vital, both on the part of the U.S. and on the part of China, and I think all 3 things have been certainly lacking on the part of the U.S. Having said that, to your specific question, I think free and fair trade is a good in and of itself. I think it is demonstrably a good in and of itself. Free trade has lifted billions of people out of poverty in this world, and while it's not perfect, and there are challenges that come with free trade, on the whole, the benefit has been enormous, not just to the U.S., not just to China, which it has certainly benefited, but also to nations at every stage of development. The U.S., in my view, should continue to be an advocate for and a catalyst for free trade. Politically, that isn't always popular, but the truth is the US is the best and most effective advocate and catalyst for free trade, and we need to continue to play that role. Yes, it is true that US economic statecraft can extend our values. I think one of the things we've learned over the course of the last several decades is that the rule of law actually helps free and fair trade, that free trade becomes difficult when the rule of law does not exist or when governments can, for no particularly clear reason, commandeer assets or make employment difficult. So I do think they are inextricably linked. And finally, I think that, yes, US economic statecraft's purpose should be to extend our influence, if not our power, militarily speaking. The last thing I would just say by way of introduction, something I will come back to over and over again, is I am concerned when we talk about China-US relations, as Prime Minister Rudd did, as Washington and Beijing. The truth is there are a whole set of actors that influence and indeed drive US economic statecraft, and they're not in Washington. They're not even governments. They are big, multinational players worth trillions upon trillions of dollars, like Apple, like Google, like Amazon. And they are true actors in this drama, and to ignore them in the conversation, I think, is unwise.
That is a terrific point, and it is something that we are going to return to later on in the conversation as well, but thank you for bringing that up right now. Senator Hussain, I think you have a different perspective. What's your view on U.S. economic statecraft? What do you think the U.S. is trying to achieve?
I'll also start with Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's comment, which is that there's a global changing balance of power, economically, militarily, and politically. And many of us in Asia view that there is an inexorable shift of power from the West to the East. So that is the context that defines. Having said that, I feel that US economic statecraft is probably today the weakest instrument of its foreign policy, tools or strategies. And more so in the last 20 years, especially post 9/11, the US track record on economic statecraft is quite inconsistent, and where policy pronouncements are not followed up by actions. And I'll just give you a few examples. Under the Bush administration in 2006, and we were the frontline state, Pakistan, my country, in the campaign against terrorism in Afghanistan, they had announced with a lot of fanfare the Reconstruction Opportunity Zones, ROZs, which were supposed to be on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, which would change the lives of the people there, and they would export goods, which would be duty-free and so forth. Nothing happened. Go to Mr. Obama, 2011. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, comes to the region, and she announces with a lot of fanfare. In July 2011.
Politicians love fanfare.
Yes, but she was Secretary of State.
Results something else.
Yes. And then she announces in July 2011 in Chennai, in India, the launch of a new Silk Road, starting from India, Afghanistan, and so forth. We know there's one Silk Road which is 2,000 years old, which starts from China, but this was a new Silk Road. Nothing happened. Then we come to fast forward to President Trump. He announces in 2018, and I went to the US Congress then, talking to Congressman Ted Yoho. I remember he was the chair of the House of Representatives Asia Pacific Subcommittee, and said, we are going to counter the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and we are launching the BUILD Act, Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development, BUILD. And a new organization was launched, IDFC, International Development Finance Corporation, $60 billion. It vanished in thin air. And last year, Mr. Biden himself announced in June 2021 in Glasgow, G7 summit, B3W, Build Back Better World, as an instrument of economic statecraft. Whatever happened to that? So this is the track record of the US. The Chinese announced in 2013 the Belt and Road Initiative, of which the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the flagship. And they've delivered. And they've delivered the projects. 145 countries have signed in, 32 international organizations, and in Pakistan they've delivered. I think within that period, $25.8 billion in 19 different early harvest projects which have been completed. So there is this element of statecraft. When I was growing up in school, we heard about the US aid and the handshake, and the economic statecraft was a very important and successful component of US foreign policy. But that's no longer the case. Unless the US can put their money where the mouth is, rather than just big announcements with fanfare, whether politicians or technocrats, it won't work.
Please respond if you'd like to.
Such an important point. And by the way, I don't disagree with a word you said.
Oh, thank you very much.
I don't disagree with a word
I'll vote for you
said.
next time when you stand.
What you're illustrating is lack of consistency, a lack of a strategic view,
Yes.
and ultimately people all over the world, it doesn't matter what culture they're in or what value system they're in, ultimately people all over the world in any set of circumstances respond to results,
Yes.
to action. So when it's all talk and no action,
Please deliver on what you say.
exactly.
Although one point of fact, which is
Americans might
that
say the same thing, but that's a whole different issue.
well, I mean, to that point, though, is a 3BW, Build Back Better World, is still theoretically in play, whereas Build Back Better America, the domestic policy, is most definitely off on the sidelines. So we'll see what happens there. One more definitional question to tackle before we kind of get into some of the meat of it. And in fact, Provost Agros already kind of hinted at this, which was this idea of whether contested cooperation is even a good way of framing the discussion about the US-China relationship. Is that overly optimistic in that, of course, it implies that there's still much scope for cooperation, or is it better to say that we're sliding towards something like a Cold War? Anybody on the panel want to? I'll take it. Please.
I think that Provost had a very valid point that in these times when the issues are global and the challenges are common, we just are recovering from the pandemic, climate change is there, issues of food and fuel insecurity are there, apart from the Ukraine war. I think that point is very valid. And in my view, having studied in the US and also been to China almost 100 times in the last 45 years, different phases, from the days of Chairman Mao to Xi Jinping, and I'm still a student of China, I'm not a specialist on China like you, I can say that there are more areas of convergence between the United States and China than of incongruence areas. And I'll say that also because, let's take Korea, we take Afghanistan. Israel is one of the best friends of China in the Middle East, by the way, and with the US also. And also I would feel in Ukraine, the one country that can influence Putin, the one leader is Xi Jinping. And I think those are areas of convergence. And I also feel that the US is today not in a position to compete with China. China has already raced ahead. It's only that US has now woken up to the reality of the rise of China because the US was too busy after 9/11 fighting wars in the Middle East region, and then suddenly there was retrenchment. They squandered $6.5 trillion in the so-called war on terror, while at the same time the Chinese were spending $4 trillion in that period on different investments all over the world, which have been very ably documented by the aid data. And I'll just end on a conversation which happened between President Trump and President Carter. I think it was in April 2018, and Carter mentioned it in his Sunday congregation in Georgia. He said, last week, President Trump called me and they said, what do we do about China? China is moving ahead. And he said, look here, I normalized relations with China in 1979, last 40 years. The US has been at war in the last 40 years, while China has been developing its own country, lifting its own people out of poverty. So they got their priorities right. They settled the issues of poverty, stability, economic development at home, and then now they have an outreach, and Yes, economic statecraft is a very important instrument of foreign policy. It promotes free trade, and today China is leading in globalization. And the US is actually backtracking on that, frankly speaking. And also, it earns them goodwill, brownie points, as it did for the US in the Cold War. And for China, that's what they're doing. So I feel that sooner or later, she needs Biden because he's going through a very important transition politically. And Biden needs she also for the American economy. And I think you will see a certain thaw in this relationship. But the US establishment, the US system is, especially the State Department or the Pentagon, they're talking, the language is, the tone is of the Cold War. A global NATO, Quad, AUKUS, China House, and the Strategic Competition Act, and Countering China Influence Fund. So there's a whole string of events which are institutionalizing that, the new enemy, as it were, when that's not the case.
So if I may, I agree with some, I disagree with some. So I absolutely agree that there is an opportunity for cooperation, to use the provost appropriate phrase. There absolutely remains that opportunity, and we should take advantage of it. I also agree that economics is the most likely place where that cooperation can occur, because in my experience with China and in China, which is perhaps not as extensive as yours, but nevertheless over a long period of time, it is actually quite productive. I was going to say easy, but that's not quite the right word, but it is fairly straightforward to reach economic agreements and accords with the Chinese, as long as the American negotiators are prepared to be firm and clear and have a clear set of objectives in mind. Where I disagree with my distinguished panelist is America will always compete with China. And I think what we're going to find out, I think actually we see it even through this difficult period where I agree, America's economic power, its global influence has perhaps waned, driven in large part by our terribly inconsistent and divisive politics. But unlike China, the US is far more than its government. The US is not driven or controlled by its government. It is driven in large part by what long ago was called civil society. And I think what we have learned thus far, and what we're going to continue to learn, is the structure of American society, the structure of our institutions, is more amenable, is more encouraging of innovation than the Chinese system. And in the end, in the 21st century, innovation wins. It's not that the Chinese are not innovative. They are. It's not that they are further ahead in certain areas than we are. They are. But having woken up, I think the US innovative capacity will surprise China.
But I just want you to read the report issued last November by the Harvard Belfer Center by Graham Allison, The Great High-Tech Rivalry, China versus the US, where they say that China has overtaken the US, whether it's the production of computers, smartphones, automobiles, 5G, artificial intelligence, robotics, cloud computing. Well, that's what the Harvard report says.
Yes, but the important point, and then we should let the ambassador jump in. The production is not the same thing as the invention. The production is not the same thing as the continuous improvement. And virtually every technology that you just mentioned was invented in the United States by United States companies with the help of the United States government. And I believe that will continue to be the case.
So I want to change the paradigm a little bit. So if you look at it from a perspective of, where the US and China are competing, if you look at certain developing countries, their perspective, and as someone who's dealt with in Asia, a lot of different countries, developing countries, and so on and so forth. Their perspective is, why can't we have both? Why do we have to pick? And so there's a transactional nature there that I think My government career is on and off for the last 20 years, so mostly it was off until it was on. So, but I think there's a challenge. Now it's back off again, which I'm kind of happy about. Gives me time to relax and rest a little bit. But I think there's a perspective that, we're not talking to our partners, allies, colleagues across, the global spectrum here on what they need from their perspective, which is different from what multilaterals like the World Bank, ADB, and to a degree AIIB, without concessional loans, what they provide. So I think from a perspective, I had a discussion with an Indonesian colleague and my Pakistani colleague, and they would always say, we want U.S. money too, because with U.S. money comes, U.S. know-how, U.S. transparency, but we wouldn't be smart not to take Chinese money because it's fast. And then therefore it's going to be the next elected official's problem to deal with kind of the debt issues. Because, I've had many discussions with counterparts, you got to worry about Chinese debt and the transparency aspect of this. To Ms. Fiorina's point.
Carly, please.
Carly.
You're Jason,
Yeah.
I'm Carly.
To Carly's point, I think, and I was part of these discussions with the Chinese on phase one and so on and so forth, a small part. But, I've dealt with Chinese colleagues on writing communiques, press releases. Those are like 8 hours of my life I can't get back because they go word by word. But there's an adherence factor. In the United States, I think we know we're going to adhere to what is written. I think there's a challenge when you go to Beijing, whether they're going to adhere to that agreement or not. Because if you look at phase one, that was agreed to with Lighthizer, Mnuchin, and Liu He. Fast forward, Biden presidency, had they agreed to any of those commitments? No, and that's kind of their MO. I wrote a note here somewhere.
Can I ask you, Jason, from your time at ADB, you talked about all the different countries that you were, regularly meeting with. I think a decade ago, that idea that China was there, it had money, it would lend quickly, that clearly was appealing and set China out as different from America and from other countries. But over the course of the decade, I think more of the downsides of that approach began to be apparent. I think the term debt trap diplomacy is a highly contested one. The evidence doesn't necessarily support that China was doing it deliberately, but nevertheless, that was the result of a lot of its actions, is that a lot of countries have ended up owing vast amounts of money to China with projects that were riven with corruption, that weren't necessarily productive. Did your conversations change? Did people, when you're talking with the Indonesians?
So they understand this,
yeah.
Right? But it's fascinating. I had this conversation with my Chinese counterparts, right? And my Chinese counterparts come from the Ministry of Finance and some from the PBOC. They're always worried about, they're a little bit worried about China XM, China Development, what they're doing economically, because the Ministry of Finance, they have to pay for it. So they're worried about their own internal dynamic of, oh crap, they're sending out billions of dollars. How are we going to pay it on the domestic side? But as I look back on my tenure at ADB and interacting, you guys are going to hear from Surdani, Alexander tomorrow, and others. I think one of my strongest talking points, and maybe not the best, but one of the strongest talking points I always used was, especially to the Chinese, how can you be a donor country with BRI sending billions of dollars to Pakistan, to Africa, all over the region, and still take billions of dollars, 1.2 from ADB or 1.3 from ADB, 700 million, 600 million from the World Bank. I think from a US perspective, I think if they stop taking money from multilaterals and said, we're purely going to be a transparent donor country, maybe that wouldn't put some aspect of the US government, at ease, but it's a very, I think it would make me a little bit more comfortable because in a way, they're having it both ways. And in my mind, you're either a donor country, second largest economy, and you're doing it out of the kind of the goodness of your heart. Because I think when the U.S. provides aid, they're doing it for the right reasons. Because as I said, there's a transparency aspect of it. When China does it, you talk about global influence and so on and so forth. I think there are those, especially in the U.S. government, and I subscribe to this thought, is there a nefarious purpose to this? Well, I don't know, because they're not being transparent about it. And I think that's a challenge that some of my counterparts face, but they will always take the money because it's there.
One more question, and I think, Carly, you already kind of opened up this topic, is the idea of right-sizing the Chinese challenge or the Chinese threat. You talked about the idea that, of course, they're doing well in a range of industries, but are they really innovating? I think in the last couple of years in particular, I think we've seen some of the core weaknesses in the Chinese model. You look at the political system, the extent to which it's increasingly concentrated in one man's grip, what that's meant with their approach for dealing with COVID, and then how that then filters out to the rest of the economy, the crackdown on the private sector, et cetera. Do you think the China threat, it's a useful political device domestically in America? It's the one area where supposedly there's bipartisan agreement. Do you think the threat is overhyped? Do you think China is weaker than we make it out to be?
So first, let me say, I do think, and I say this, it's a bipartisan comment. Politicians look for villains and heroes. It's what they do, and at least in the United States. And is the light getting dimmer, or is that just me?
Well, you're giving the light. You should shed light on China.
So in the U.S., our politicians look for heroes and villains, and
It's all over the world.
Yeah, to sort of galvanize action and support, et cetera. And so, of course, right now, China is a villain, and of course, that is a vast oversimplification. If bipartisan support of China as a villain causes the U.S. legislature to say in a bipartisan way, we really ought to be investing more in government R&D to make sure that the United States remains the research powerhouse of the world, great, because that needs to happen. Industry can benefit from government-funded research. However, it's clearly wrong. I don't think that China is going to take over the world, although they may have an intention to do so. I don't think that they are invulnerable, but I do think that their system has clear strengths. And I think the greatest strength that China has of all, going back to the senator's point, they are, in my experience, clear, consistent, strategic. They are clear about their intentions. They never beat around the bush. Hong Kong is ours, Taiwan is ours, we're going to go build the Belt Road, et cetera. They're very clear. They're very consistent. They follow through. The results matter. And they are strategic. They take the long view. And so while I think there are vulnerabilities in their system that are going to become more and more apparent, while I think that we can and will continue to compete effectively against them, while I think, I'm sorry, the provost's phrase, managed competition, whatever that phrase was.
Contested cooperation.
Yes, contested cooperation is the right phrase. While I do think we need to push back on them militarily by telling them clearly and consistently what the costs of military adventurism will be, it is foolish to cast China either as our 100% enemy or as 100% villain, but it is equally foolish to cast them as weaker than they are, or stronger than they are. And I continue to believe that economic, what we would call in the industrial world, co-opetition is very common in the business world. And I think that's what we have with China. It's what we should expect from China. And we need to be clear-eyed and consistent and strategic as we engage in that co-opetition instead of verbose, inconsistent, which means, just to get to the punchline here, at least from my point of view, government clearly has an important role to play. Washington has an important role to play. But I would hope that our institutions of government, the Defense Department, the State Department, USAID, I hope our institutions of government will become less prone to the political rhetoric that rages all around them, not more prone. If there was ever a time for the bureaucracy to churn along, irrespective of who was in the White House, I think it's with regard to the relationship with China.
So one point, from one thing I always discuss with the Chinese when I was overseas was, I think you see small cracks which could turn into bigger cracks in China, and it all stems from kind of like this one-child policy, because, but that's all pervasive through Northeast Asia with Japan and Korea, because they don't have the birth rate and so on and so forth. So domestic economically speaking, I think there's going to be significant challenges. I'm not saying the next year or so or the next 5 years, but I think, but in the United States, we're also suffering from lower birth rates. Some would say that's COVID or so on and so forth. But there's a history in Northeast Asia where the birth rates, replacement, I forgot the terminology, but they don't have the birth rate, increased birth rate, where they need to still be able to care for the older Chinese, because the state does provide everything. And so I think you'll see some small cracks turning into bigger cracks economically in China domestically, which could impact a lot of their foreign and global goals.
Yeah. Senator Hussain, I want to ask you, we've already talked a little bit about what China brings to the table in terms of its stability, its long-term planning, arguable, but nevertheless, many believe that's the case. What, in your view, does the U.S. bring to the table? What would you, when we're here talking about U.S. economic statecraft, and you've talked about how it's become a very weak element of the diplomatic toolkit, but for a country like Pakistan, what would you like to see from the U.S.? What can America do that China cannot?
Very good question. Number one, market access. I think U.S. is a huge market. For Pakistan, it's our biggest exporter. Number two, and I'm a product of that, top quality education. Outstanding. U.S.'s strength is soft power, innovation, ideas, science, technology, even Hollywood for that matter, or fast food. And then also the U.S. influence on international global financial institutions, which Jason worked for, IMF, World Bank, that is there. And overall, I think they're still, although the America I knew when I was a student has changed. It's so polarized, it's so divisive, it's like a third world country, people. I can't watch Fox News or CNN because they're attacking everybody. But there's still that mystique or the razzle and dazzle of American society, which is very alluring for a lot of people. And once upon a time, of course, the US was also a major supplier of arms to Pakistan, but now the US stopped that for political reasons. The preference is India, but we're getting almost the same quality from China and other countries. So the US has a lot to offer still, but they have to get their act together. And I think the retrenchment of American power we have seen from Saudi Arabia to South Asia is so apparent. And now, of course, we are seeing welcome U-turns by President Biden. Yeah. So we hope that there will be strategic clarity. We don't see that happening, and it's a lot of one step forward, two steps backward approach within US foreign policy, and especially in economic statecraft. And just one point, I agree with Carly what she mentioned. Jason mentioned about corruption. And I think corruption is not necessarily a Chinese monopoly, because if you want to know about corruption, Afghanistan, $100 million a day. Please read the report of SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, 17th of August, 2021. They talked of an army of 350,000. It was a ghost army, okay, 50,000. Yep. And who made the money? The top corporations. Carly, is not your corporation, but others.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Corruption, unfortunately, exists everywhere. And,
yes.
perhaps
$2
different
trillion were squandered in Afghanistan. And how much went into the pockets of Afghan or American politicians or American big corporations? That the aid data will have to figure out.
Afghanistan is definitely not the crowning accomplishment of American statecraft of any sort. There's no dispute about that. You put your finger on something, which is, you said that, talking about what the U.S. offers, the number one item on your list was market access. This is a question for Carly is, market access, how is that delivered? It's delivered through trade deals. Right now, the idea of trade deals, especially kind of big regional undertakings, is anathema in Washington, D.C. The U.S. pulled out of the TPP. As I mentioned, they've launched this new economic framework, but there's not going to be any kind of binding element to it. It's not going to be put before Congress. If the U.S. cannot do or is unwilling to do trade deals in Asia or more generally globally to revitalize the WTO, how big of a blow is that to U.S. economic statecraft? Do you see any way of shifting the conversation in D.C. to make that kind of thing possible again?
So let me divide your question in two parts. First, let's talk about the trade deals themselves, and then let's talk about the actors involved in trade, because they're two different things in many cases. So trade deals themselves, one of the reasons that there's a reluctance to enter into these big, global, complex trade deals is all the way back to a point Jason made. Not everybody plays by the rules. And so there is enormous energy expended over years to get the rules and the commitments laid out. And some won't play by those rules. WTO and China is the classic example. WTO was negotiated for years, and U.S. companies participated in that negotiation, my company and myself personally among them. Rules were hammered out, and China chose to abide by the rules when they wanted and not abide by them when they didn't want. And so when you have this complex, bureaucratic undertaking, and then you have players who say, nah, we're not playing, yes, people begin to say, why are we expending this kind of energy? I think it's why you see, from a very practical point of view, more and more people in both parties saying complex multilateral deals are difficult to negotiate, they are difficult to enforce, and therefore we don't get the benefits that we hope to. Far better, perhaps, far more practical to engage in bilateral negotiations or more limited engagements. Now, I give Biden credit for trying to re-energize a more limited scope. TPP, in my judgment, at the time was far too complicated to actually get anything done. Sort of like the world tax deal, wonderful, everybody agrees in principle, in my opinion, has no hope of actually getting executed. But, so, yes, I think the U.S., as I said at the outset, needs to continue to be an advocate and a catalyst for free trade and for global trade for a host of reasons, including benefit to us and our companies, but benefit to others. However, I think we have to be pragmatic about what kinds of agreements actually will get executed, and can we hold people accountable to those agreements? It's clear the WTO does not hold players accountable. Having said all that, there are a whole set of actors who are engaged in trade and economic statecraft with China, and they're not governments. They're Hewlett-Packard and Apple and Google and Amazon and Credit Suisse and Nestle and all these companies. And the thing that I find so interesting about China now, and a vulnerability, I must say, is that a whole set of companies, from the technology sector to the finance sector to the consumer product sector, a whole set of industrial players went into China with a clear set of expectations about what over the long term they could benefit by being in China. And their expectation was that it would mean not just revenue, but profit. That market access meant profit. And I think what they are finding out is the revenue looks great on the income statement, but the profit never materializes. Not never, but not at the expectation that is normal given the level of revenue. And I think you have a set of industrial players who now resent and are stressed under the heavy-handed approach of the Chinese government, which continues around who you can partner with, who you shouldn't partner with, what you really are permitted to do. And in this regard, going back to Jason's point, I do think the Chinese government wants to have it both ways. We are strong, we are powerful, we are going to become the leading player in the world, but when it's convenient, we're a poor developing nation and you need to understand and we need a special deal, and you cannot have it both ways. I'm not being pejorative, by the way. I have enormous admiration and affection for the Chinese at every level in China. And I enjoy dealing with them tremendously. But I do think they try and play it both ways. So my point in saying this is, I think one of the things China has been able to count on for the last 20 years is, despite the misgivings of the politicians and despite the difficulties of these multilateral trade deals, American companies and others, but let's just say American companies, have continued to want to engage in the Chinese economy. And I think that enthusiasm is waning. And I think it will continue to wane, and I think COVID accelerated that. Because you have a set of global companies now who are saying, I will not trust my supply chain solely to China ever again. Because I understand what happens when a government makes a unilateral decision that I have no control over. And so I think what you're going to see is supply chains moving to redundancy and multiple source. China no longer has the cheapest labor in the world. There are all sorts of dynamics now that are causing these non-state economic actors to reevaluate the closeness and the criticality of their economic relationship with China.
Let me just follow up on that for a second, if I may, is just the, there's this core tension. You're absolutely right to say that a lot of American companies, foreign companies, are dissatisfied with the way that the government treats them in China. But that's predicated on the idea that they still want to have access to this vast, vast market. They still see profits that are there to be tapped and unlocked.
They hope.
They hope. Whereas at the political level, of course, the distance between the West, defined broadly, and China is only getting bigger, to the point that I think it was more apparent in the Trump administration, but even in the Biden administration, there's this sense that they don't trust American companies to do what is ultimately in America's strategic interest. So how is that tension resolvable, and ultimately will politics win out? I see, Jason, you also want to.
Yeah, I wanted to go back, but I think American companies, especially now, they're being caught between, U.S. mindset, U.S. policymaker mindset, and kind of this profit revenue mode because of human rights issues, the highlighting of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, among others. So I think there's a spotlight on them where they're being caught in between. But so I think that's giving some of our more, especially at the manufacturing side, is that it's giving them a pause on how do we navigate, the recent legislation, regarding the Xinjiang and Uyghurs in compliance, but also still be able to have our manufacturing supply chain based in China. Secondly, I want to bring up a point, and I was talking to a couple senators a few weeks ago. I think there is an appetite for free trade agreements, especially on the bilateral side. I know the United Kingdom, I remember when I was back in the Treasury Department in 2018, they were discussing a UK free trade agreement. But one thing I've noticed is, and one of the senators brought this up, is the Biden administration has not brought up, trade promotion authority or fast track authority to Congress. So I think that's very telling, because I don't think they have an appetite, based on whether you want to call it unions or whatever domestic political considerations, to go through any type of free trade agreement. through the regular order process. I think what you'll see is like these kind of like these strategic frameworks, these non-binding strategic frameworks, which, you know, I think from the two senators I spoke to is a concern for them because that takes away their kind of authority being, you know, the treaty approvers, if you will. So I want to bring up those 2 points. So, okay.
So in response to your question, let me go back to something that I said earlier. One of the complaints that politicians have, and indeed American citizens sometimes have, is around the deep state, you know, this vast bureaucracy that's not directed by the will of the people. But in some cases, the bureaucracy is there to play a consistent role over time. And not all government bureaucracies are bad. I said earlier that I would hope, particularly with regard to China, that we would develop beneath the political level a more consistent, coherent, strategic, clear policy with regard to China, especially at the State Department, the Defense Department, and USAID. Below the political level, I know because I've been engaged in them, those organizations collaborate on a fairly regular basis, and I think we need to encourage them to do so. And to your specific question, I think if state and defense and USAID would spend more time engaged in collaboration and dialogue with U.S. economic companies and actors, it would help our policy tremendously. Yes, even business has become politicized in our current environment, you know, woke corporations and all this. But, and I have been advocating this to secretaries of defense and state for now 15 years. So this is a consistent point on my part. U.S. companies want to advance American interests if they can. But if there's no communication, no collaboration, no dialogue, and no understanding, that's less likely. And so if there is an ongoing set of communications and collaborations between the functionaries at state and defense and USAID and U.S. companies, I think it would benefit us tremendously, and I think it would benefit U.S.-China relations tremendously. And it does not happen systematically. It happens a little bit, but not systematically.
I'd just like to add there are 1,100 Chinese companies functioning in China.
Yes.
And the more are coming in. And recently, BlackRock, I think, raised $1 billion, and they are investing more. So the opportunities are...
Absolutely, opportunities are there.
Senator Hussain, I want to dive into a couple of concrete topics, questions, and then open up the floor to the audience here. We've mentioned a couple times the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and I know that you're intimately involved in that. Recently, I'd say the run of news has been more negative than positive. There's concerns, I think, from both sides of the partnership. On the Pakistani side, there have been reports about the billions that were promised and only millions that have been delivered. On the Chinese side, there's lots of concerns about the security environment after a couple of attacks that killed Chinese nationals in Pakistan. So and this kind of gets back to something that I've mentioned before, but part of the premise of this conversation is the idea of the unstoppable Chinese juggernaut and that they're delivering what they say they're going to deliver. Is that really true? What are the problems?
Well, I think that's really true because, as Carly said, we should judge any initiative, any project by its results. And in a country like Pakistan, and of course India also, we have a very large bureaucratic red tape, which really is difficult to slice at times. But despite that, the first phase of CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, has been successful in achieving its goals. And I mentioned already the projects, the early harvest projects. I also mentioned about the investment Yes, there are issues. We have had a change of government in Pakistan. There have been security issues, attacks on Chinese projects, which we feel have external sponsorship. And there's been the COVID issue. But despite COVID, the 75,000 Pakistanis who work for Chinese projects, none of them have been affected. And last week, the army chief went with a high-level military delegation to Beijing, to China, Qingdao, I think it was, and they talked to the Chinese counterparts about beefing up security for Chinese projects. There are about 120 different Chinese projects in Pakistan, about almost 20,000 Chinese experts, engineers, and technicians working in different projects, not just CPEC, overall. And they predate that. And for the next phase, which is being planned, we are expecting in the planning and execution and projects which are yet to be completed, about $28.4 billion in about 20 different projects, and especially also the special economic zones, which will generate in the next phase 500,000 jobs directly and 1.2 million jobs indirectly. So the best of CPEC is yet to come. And the Chinese leadership, the top leadership, Xi Jinping and the Premier Li Keqiang, they don't travel, but we are expecting very high-level Chinese visitors soon to Islamabad to take this initiative forward. I think it's probably going to be Mr. Yang Jiechi, who met Jake Sullivan last week. He's the senior leader on foreign policy. He used to be interpreter of Deng Xiaoping also. So it's on track, and I would say the best of CPEC is yet to come, and the new focus is also on agriculture, on science and technology, on information technology, on education, and also on energy.
Can I ask Ambassador Chung, we talked about 3BW, and again, the idea there is that America somehow should have a response to BRI. Is that right? I mean, as Ms. Farina has mentioned several times, part of the strength of the US system is kind of the overall ecosystem of companies, of civil society. Does there need to be a government packaged response?
I'll take the realistic view, and I don't think we can have one, because BRI has 10 years of history. That being said, I think and I'd go back to say, Congress needs to stop rating you guys know what the 150 account is, where, U.S., aid comes from the one big account so Congress needs to stop, because whenever they need to cut budgets, they always go after the 150 account first. And so I was like the one aberration in the Treasury Department when I said, you guys got to stop rating the 150 account, and please give me $400 million so I could pay our ADB arrears, right? And I had it through, Secretary Mnuchin approved that, but then it got kicked back by OMB, so I had one win and one major loss. But I don't think we can, and I don't think we should. I think what we need to provide is what the US is very well known for, which is like kind of this academic approach to looking at these projects. So similar to what A-Data provides, the Treasury Department, the State Department, they have all these tools in its tool belt. Treasury has Office of Technical Assistance, which they, at the request of governments, foreign governments, they send out experts, or they provide experts who can look at various different things. The Philippines has done it, Laos, Cambodia have had these in the past. So I think those are some type of economic statecraft tools, which is very kind of not like this micro level, which I think is something that the U.S. government needs to provide and needs to do more of. I would say, we've done it in Pakistan, and I would tell you, my Pakistani college, his daughter is a recent graduate and a proud recent graduate of William and Mary. So he always had to remind me that when we had these conversations. But I would say that, from a Pakistani context, from a U.S., they still borrow heavily from the multilaterals.
Yes.
And the challenge for the multilaterals, and I had this conversation with David Malpass and President Asakawa at the ADB, is, Pakistan, like other countries, are reaching up to that level where they can't borrow anymore. And so you got to rejigger, how much they can borrow. I remember the last two projects I approved, and I told this to my Pakistani colleague, make sure you come and ask for the $1.2 billion together. The last thing I want to do is go back to Treasury and State and say, $350 million here, $750 million there. Just come to me with one big package and let's just get it over with and pull the Band-Aid off. And I said, but you got to promise me all the aid that we're going to provide you, please make sure it doesn't go to your debt repayment plan to China. And he assured me it wouldn't. But when the money goes to the account, I'm realistic enough that the money becomes fungible. So, but I think we have tools. I think we have some of the best individuals at our State Department, at our Treasury Department as attaches, who talk to their bilaterally, on the working level. I think the challenge for, especially in the U.S. system, is how do we get our political leadership in place? I think Jake Sullivan's easy because the president said you're my national security advisor. I think Anthony Blinken has a little bit of a challenge because he's just getting his senior political leadership in, and I was talking to someone earlier. An undersecretary of public diplomacy has not been confirmed. You see that same thing in Treasury, where the undersecretary for international affairs, Treasury's top economic, the U.S. government's top economic diplomat, although my State Department colleagues may disagree. They don't have anyone in place who can have these high-level strategic discussions on a political level.
They've nominated somebody, Jay Shambaugh, but he's not yet.
Yeah, I know.
So,
I come to help him get through as long as my.
I have more questions, but I'm conscious of time ticking down. We've yet to open up the floor. So, are there questions out there that anybody would like to raise? Gentleman in the back. Maybe come up to the microphone and say your name and affiliation, please.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm Paul Watzlawick. I'm State Department Career Foreign Service Officer, currently serving as State Department Chair at National Intelligence University. I have a comment and then I have a question kind of down the road looking at where we're going. So you all know that over the last 25 to 30 years, we've had millions of Chinese students studying in the United States. United States has benefited from that. Obviously, China has benefited from that. The vast majority of those have returned and helped populate a robust and diverse academic network now in China, to the extent that their investments and patent level developments are outstripping our own in some ways. So with that, of course, comes the desire to see your, i.e. the Chinese looking at this, your technology being that which is setting world standards and world norms. And the US and Western Europe for the last 100 years have really been at the forefront of setting standards and norms that we all have benefited from, particularly in the business community. So looking at your diverse experience and expertise, how do you see China's interest in using its 130 different relationships around the world to develop and to shape new international norms and standards that might be more favorable to their interests? Thank you.
Well, I think certainly China has a keen interest in doing so, obviously. And I understand why they have a keen interest in doing so. And I think they will continue to push in that direction. And I think the United States should be unembarrassed about pushing back in every situation where we think their declaration of standards does not meet either our interests or the interests of the world at large. One of the things that I admire about China is they are not confused about whose interest they are trying to further. They are trying to further their own interests. They are very clear, and there's nothing wrong with that. I do think, as I've tried to suggest, I do think as much power concentrated in such a small handful of a gerontocracy is a problem. But nevertheless, the Chinese are clear. They operate for their own self-interest. And if they can lift others up along the way, great. But fundamentally, they're operating for their own self-interest. And our best way of dealing with them is to recognize that and not try and change their values. Our views of their treatment of the Uyghurs are irrelevant to them, although they may not be irrelevant to our companies. The only way we influence them is to influence their calculation of their self-interest. And we have a lot of tools to do that. So therefore, as the Chinese come in and try and influence international standards, which by definition must serve more interests than just the Chinese, someone has to push back. And we, I think, are the obvious candidate to push back, both because of our own expertise, because of our leadership in the past, because of our technological innovation, et cetera. And so we shouldn't be embarrassed about it. We shouldn't explain it away. We shouldn't let people say this isn't consistent with your values. No, actually, we're here to represent our interests and the interests of those other nations who believe, as we do, in an international order, in an interdependent world, and in the rule of law.
So can I,
Yeah, please
so,
go ahead.
but I would say that, I mean, it's not like, yes, sir, I think they're trying to set up parallel tracks, but they are still adhering towards kind of the existing order. I mean, you look at the number of patents Chinese companies or state-owned enterprise file with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, with the same thing what they do with the Koreans and so forth. So they still have a common understanding that they need to adhere to kind of their, the current status quo. But that current status quo also protects their global interests or their U.S. domestic interests by filing patents with the Patent Office. So, they are following, they're just not saying like, let's throw out the current world order. Maybe they are in certain aspects, but they still play by a certain set of rules because it benefits them.
Yes, but. Yes, but. The current U.S. patent system is incredibly cumbersome and antiquated. I don't know what I am about to say, but I think it is also a reasonable hypothesis that the Chinese have concluded it is in their interests to flood the U.S. patent system with a set of applications that gum up the works for everyone else. And they're not doing too bad a job of that, actually.
I think that's
I see a question, yeah.
IBM, but now it's like some
Back there, yes,
Chinese.
please, come on up. And the guy next to you after you, if you want to do two in a row.
Thanks for a terrific panel. My name is Andy Cutchins. I'm a visiting scholar here at William & Mary. I was most recently president of the American University in Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, for a few years. And just a comment there, the experience of the Kyrgyz in the Belt and Road Initiative is viewed quite negatively by the population there. They view that the Chinese donors are cutting deals that are corrupted with certain political leaders, and that often the projects are primarily the employers are Chinese workers, which are not at all popular. And thirdly, they've accrued a tremendous debt to the Chinese over the years, to the point where a couple of years ago the legislature passed a law that there will be no further taking on of Chinese debt. And this is an example, but we see this story multifold in the Belt and Road Initiative story. My question to you has to do with your optimism, actually, about Chinese economic growth into the future. China is right now a middle-income growth country, according to the World Bank standards. And they've achieved tremendous results over the last 40 years in growing and bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But the biggest challenge for growing economies is avoiding the middle income trap, getting past that level of middle income growth. And what's critical to get past the trap are the institutions that support economic growth at a much higher level, and that will support more innovation at a much higher level. And this really comes down to rule of law, good governance, transparency, all those things we like to talk about. But the fact is, there aren't too many things in economics and political science literature that one could say are an iron rule, but I think that is pretty much one of them. And when I look at what Xi Jinping has been doing in China for particularly the last 5 years, I've reached the conclusion that he's in danger of killing the goose that lays the golden egg. He carried out a so-called anti-corruption campaign a number of years ago, which led to the arrest of 1.5 million, at least, high-level Communist Party officials, as well as business leaders. And of course, it was a consolidation of his own political authority under the guise of an anti-corruption campaign. So I won't go through other data points that lead me to be concerned about the future of the sustainability of relatively high Chinese economic growth, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective.
Those are great points. I'm gonna actually invite another questioner to come up just because time is ticking down. And I think that was quite an eloquent statement. I think you've laid out the case quite clearly that maybe we are overly optimistic in looking at China. One point of fact, which is that I think by World Bank standards, China is about to be a high-income country because you get there when you're $12,000 per capita, and China's at $11,500. So theoretically, they'll break out of the middle-income trap, but I think the bigger point still stands. Question, please, yeah.
I'm the guy next to him.
Yes.
I'm Walter Lohman, Director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. I wanted to follow up with Carly, if I could, on business sentiment on China, because I hear the narrative about disappointment in China and companies leaving and all that all of the time. But if you look at the numbers don't say that. You have increased levels of investment into China from the United States, from the world. They just came off their biggest year ever in history in terms of FDI incoming. Look at the trade figures, you look at subsidiary sales in China. There's this disconnect between the narrative that we have around the interest in China from business and what's actually happening. And I'm always trying to square this, like, why is this the case? I wonder if you could explain it.
Well, in fact, I think your comment and the previous gentleman's comment go hand in hand, because I actually think both things are true. I think the narrative is the leading indicator, and the FDI is the lagging indicator. And what I mean by that is, I think companies are coming to grips with the consequences for them and for their bottom lines of all the things that the previous speaker commented on. They are coming to grips with the consequences to them of the way the Chinese government operates, the way the Chinese economy actually operates, and they are calibrating or recalibrating their thinking about China in the future. Now, having said that, you can't not be in China. Talk about market access. I mean, it is the largest consumer market in the world. There are very, very few companies of any origin that would say, I'm out. But I think what companies are doing, as I say, is recalibrating their expectations. And I think they are recalibrating their thinking about what they must do to protect themselves. And the supply chain would be one example. I think 10 years ago, companies were incredibly optimistic about the extent to which they could rely on a Chinese-based supply chain. And I think they are recalibrating that very rapidly now. And they have concluded, yes, the Chinese market is going to be part of our portfolio. Yes, the Chinese might be part of our supply chain, but they are part. And we're more realistic about what part they will play. The final comment I would make is, if I'm conveying optimism about Chinese economic growth or Chinese political power, that is perhaps a mistake on my part. What I'm conveying optimism around is I do think there is the opportunity to have legitimate and productive cooperation at the economic level, and to be strategic and consistent and clear so we don't have an unintended war, to Prime Minister Rudd's point. But I think there are, to the previous gentleman's point, I think there are a lot of yellow flags flashing, yellow lights flashing in terms of the Chinese future and their impact on the world that we need to be aware of.
I just add to what the gentleman who was in Bishkek mentioned. And by the way, there's also the Aga Khan's University of Central Asia now in Bishkek, where a lot of Pakistani, and headed by a Pakistani, and there are about 2,000 Pakistani students there. You mentioned about the anti-corruption campaign. You see, for the Chinese and the Communist Party of China, from my reading of their leadership, especially Xi Jinping, two things are in their DNA. One is the century of humiliation, the history where they said never again. The second one is the example of the Soviet Union, a fat and flabby and corrupt communist party led by incompetent leadership, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party, the current leadership, and is very clear they won't allow that to happen. And Xi Jinping has taken a very strong position. For example, two of the top 4- and 5-star generals were arrested for corruption. They were selling promotions. Others had gold bars in their house. One was executed, the other committed suicide. So that's never happened before. And they were vice chairman of the Central Military Commission of the Communist Party of China, the apex of the military leadership. So I think that he has used that, and he even took on their head of intelligence, Zhou Yonggang, and he's in jail also. So I think that that experience of the Soviet Union, where the Communist Party elite became corrupted, incompetent, and a very flabby Communist Party, he won't allow that to happen. That's the biggest fear.
Thank you, Senator Hussain.
I must say, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is the way of the world. And Xi Jinping holds absolute power. It is corrupting.
Time is really running down, and I see quite a few questions. So can I ask basically everybody who has a question to come up to a microphone? Let's do a round robin. Get your statements, get your questions, then hopefully we can have a summation and responses. Why don't you start
go
first?
Okay, great. Thank you. Jim Paris, I work for USAID, currently posted in Tajikistan. Last year I was in Karachi.
Oh.
Wonderful time
Come
there.
to Islamabad and Lahore also.
I did visit, but I also was supposed to visit Gwadar, and this gets to my question, really. I want to follow up a bit on what Jason was asking, because trying to understand a little bit about how much analysis is done on the effectiveness of the Chinese projects in Pakistan, particularly CPEC, but even prior. You know, my memory, this was maybe 18 years ago, meeting with a Chinese counterpart to Jim Kelly. He was meeting with her, and she said, we're going to build you this wonderful port that's going to change the trade in Pakistan, move a lot of the shipments from Port Karachi, Port Qasim to Gwadar. At this point, is it like really what Charles de Gaulle said of Brazil, that it's the port of the future and always will be? Or is there, you know, what's happened to Gwadar, what's happened to some of the other projects? Is there a good analysis on the results of what Chinese assistance has done? I think there's a good explanation in Brad's book on Hambantota port and those schemes, and is it similar? Are there comparisons or not? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So question number one is about Gwadar analysis. Yeah, please.
Just very quickly, I'm Musharraf. I live and work in Pakistan for a small advisory services firm called Tabad Lab. I'm, you know, in Pakistan, we get a lot of this admiration for Chinese clarity and I guess clarity and its ability to execute on plans. And we always look at our own democracy as being really messy, and it makes it impossible to get stuff done. Our Army Chief of Staff, the one that's currently in power, is known to have, you know, commented about how envious he is of some of the more brutal ways in which China has sought to control the public discourse and be as strategic as it's able to be. I guess I have a worry, and it's in the form of a question, I hope, which is that when I see similar expressions of, you know, admiration for Chinese clarity, I guess I want to take back to Islamabad with me some advice from you, Ms. Fiorina, but from everyone here, as to whether we're actually looking at an inflection point in terms of our intellectual commitment to messy, vibrant democracies. I know it's been very unpleasant for American friends, particularly the elites on both sides of both coasts. It's certainly the case for Pakistani elites, of which at least I'm a outside member and, you know, aspirational. But it's very uncomfortable for all of us to have the populism that the U.S. has to deal with, that Pakistan hasn't had to deal with in quite such a manner yet. But we're going to get our own version of Trump. It wasn't Imran Khan. There's worse actors out there. either we, no, it's true, and you should be scared. But the point is, I mean, I know I am. But the point of the question is, do we stick with this and actually engage in a serious conversation about addressing populism, because it's being driven by a lack of being a participant in the high average incomes that many of the elite, have access to? We're all, many of us at least, a lot of us are beneficiaries of the neoliberal order, and so I think it's not good enough to excuse ourselves for our messy democracies by saying, well, look at China, they're able to execute. They're able to do that because there was no freedom in China. So either we choose, what, George Washington and many folks in this region, including in this town, kind of stood for, or we come up with some sort of a hybrid thing. And at least in our recent experience, as the senator will attest, our attempts at hybridization haven't been as successful as they could be. We love Dubai, we love China. I know I do, I really do. But I'm also conscious that the cost of that might not be a cost I'm willing to pay. I'm actually happy with a messy, dysfunctional system that gets to a middle income status in 25 years, as long as people's rights are guaranteed and we get to say what we're feeling, because that is the razzle-dazzle bit that I think we mess. It's not Top Gun or Maverick that's actually the appeal. It's the idea that some kid in Karachi or Gwadar could come up with that film in its own time. And so I just like maybe a juxtaposition as to which way to go. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Snow. I live in Tokyo, Japan, and I also teach at Schwartzman College at Tsinghua University. My question has to do with bridging that region. When I live in Tokyo, I advise the government of Japan on messaging to the English-speaking world. You can see Japan's rise now in international relations, Kishida being the first prime minister to participate in the upcoming NATO summit. A lot of the language coming out of Japan is very much oriented toward moralizing that the U.S. and Japan, along with the Quad members, stand in opposition to the authoritarian state. But if you look at Greater Asia, they're playing, again, both sides. There was a Future of Asia conference in Tokyo a few weeks ago. The Singaporean Prime Minister, as well as many other speakers coming from South Asia, have said, we're going to continue to work with China. We don't like all of this sort of black-white language being used of this, we're the good guys with the white hats. And if you recall, after Biden was elected, what did the U.S. do but sort of finger wag at China? And then they had the Alaska meeting, which was really a deteriorating sort of consequence of this discourse. So I'm trying to be a bridge builder in that part of the world, but it's difficult because you usually have to specialize in one country. And so living in Japan, I'm a little bit suspect at times to my Japanese counterparts because I dare to go to Beijing to teach at Schwartzman College, which everybody knows was funded. It's the largest private philanthropic initiative, over $600 million. Of course, Stephen A. Schwartzman involved in that. So is that a good? Is that a public good? Or are we being sort of, suckered? Because look at also the exchange diplomacy aspect to this. The outgoing Chinese, we don't have that reciprocal relationship coming from Japan, much less the United States. So thank you so much for this panel. It's been terrific.
Thank you. But by the way, before you raise your point, just to say, we've been given a few extra minutes, which means that there's not going to be a rest break between this panel and the next one. So if anybody feels the urge or has a need, go and avail yourself now, because we'll go straight into the next panel after this discussion. Yeah.
Great, thanks. My name's Don Niss. I work in the Africa Bureau at USAID. And about 9 years ago, we started something called Power Africa, where we really brought together all of the different tools of the U.S. government, along with partnering with a number of, I think it's over 100 private sector companies now, in trying to bring everybody together and get the government to move more quickly in a more coordinated way. And so it's an interesting model. And we know that we did that because we know we can't compete. We don't have the money, as Jason noted, in the 150 account and our assistance account to compete with the dollars that China has. You know, we've tried in some places. I know, like in 2010 or so, we were spending about $1 billion a year in Pakistan on largely infrastructure and other things. And so I wanted to get comments mainly from Carly and Jason, but others as well. How can the U.S. government do a better job of engaging both on issues related to China, but more broadly on encouraging work like Power Africa around the world? And how can we move more quickly and nimbly and stay attuned to what it is businesses need?
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Christopher Kilby. I'm a professor of economics at Villanova University. There's been a little bit of, at least from a few of the speakers, of a sense that we should stay the course. The United States should continue to promote free trade around the world. And I wonder whether when we look at this, we don't see that as this, if we look back to the 90s, that the United States viewed this as something that would go hand in hand with democratization, that higher income levels, that prosperity would lead toward moves toward democracy. And in fact, what we've seen, particularly in China and Russia, but elsewhere as well, is the opposite, that the resources have gone to some countries that are not moving in that direction, and that in some sense the US push toward free trade has simply handed more wealth and resources toward countries that are working against US interests. So I think just comments on whether that should factor into US policy moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an incredible range of questions. So just to kind of briefly remind you a couple of the main points, and then feel free to, we can go in order, feel free to address any of the points that you want to. So there was a key kind of technical question to start with, which is the port of Gwadar in Pakistan, which of course is where China now has, I think it's a 40-year lease, a long-term lease on the port. Lots of concerns in America about it, lots of optimism in Pakistan about what it might deliver economically. Have there been good analyses of what it's actually done? Is it turning into another kind of Hamban Tota situation in Sri Lanka, or does it look better than that? The question about, are we at an inflection point in how we regard democracy versus authoritarian regimes? Is messy better, even if it's slower? Should we kind of throw our lot in with messy because of the inalienable human rights that are respected through it? The question from Japan about, is it possible to build bridges? What kind of advice do you give to people who want to try to build bridges over this chasm, which now seems, impossibly wide? What kind of advice do you give to governments to get them to engage with projects like Power Africa? And then finally, this idea of pushing towards free trade. We talked about the idea that one of the key things that the US wants to deliver is this liberal international economic order. Politically, is that a good thing, though? Does that just give too much power to countries that take advantage of it, that don't align with US values and principles? So an easy set of topics. Do you want to start, Jason?
So I'll take the Japan issue. I think the one thing that the Japanese do well is they work through a multilateral context. And I think that's an opportunity for the US, despite certain misgivings from the administration I worked for. But if they didn't believe in some type of multilateralism, they wouldn't put me there, right? So, but I think the Japanese have, I think for the United States to be kind of key actors in this, we got to work through our bilateral, multilateral partners. I mean, if you look at the context of North Korea trying to get captives out of North Korea, who did we work through? We worked through the Swedish and and others to get Americans out of North Korea. So I look at it that kind of like that type of context, that multilateralism works, especially when the Japanese are kind of leading because they know the region, and everybody in that region understands what Japan was and what they're trying to do now historically. The other question I wanted to answer was the one after, which was, kind of like the Sri Lanka aspect, right? So what I would always suggest countries do is like, one, borrow what you can bilaterally, but make sure you negotiate. They need to negotiate terms, right? I think what countries start to realize is that China does not provide any type of concessional lending. AIIB, I think, did one concessional loan because I think they were forced to do so, but that's not in their toolkit. Secondly, it's like when countries come to with these types of agreements with China, if they're going to do it, they should walk down the street to the U.S. Embassy and say, hey, is this a good deal? Because I think what the U.S. can provide is saying, and there were programs associated with this, like whether it's Blue Dot and so on and so forth. Countries should strive for competition, between the United States and China. I think there was a discussion where, someone said, don't be afraid to take the Chinese money, but let's make sure that it's for your benefit. Secondly, I think, as lenders and, we got to look at aspects of providing local currency lending, especially with what's going on with the global economy today with inflationary pressures for a lot of these countries. If China provided non-dollar denominated loans, I think that would help with a lot of these countries with some of the things they want to do as well.
Thank you. Senator Hussain?
Yeah. About Gwadar. First of all, I think the comparison of Gwadar and Hambantota is wrong. Gwadar was motivated and initiated by successive Pakistani governments essentially on economic grounds. Hambantota was driven by political considerations, especially the Mahinda Rajapakse family, because that's the constituency of Rajapakse, the current ruling family. But on the so-called debt trap, I'd like you to read this article in The Atlantic, which appeared last year, 6th of February 2021, The Myth of the Chinese Debt Trap, written by two American professors, one from Harvard, one from Yale. And that really sets the record straight. It separates fact from fiction. And regarding Gwadar, it was our initiative. We asked the Chinese to build the port. And they started building it in 2003. By the way, it was started by Prime Minister Mr. Nawaz Sharif in the 1990s. We couldn't get the funding. Then Benazir Bhutto, she tried it also. Then finally, General Musharraf went to the Chinese in 2002. Zhu Rongji was the Prime Minister. And the Chinese did it on the fast track. We said it's a special request from a special friend, Pakistan. And within 3 months, they had the feasibility, the funding, everything ready, tuck, 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 Chinese style, as you say. So, and they built it in 2003. 2007, they completed it. And then they handed it over to Pakistan. Okay, we've done it. We are leaving. We are not interested in Gwadar. They gave it to us. We gave it to the Ports of Singapore Authority. And they failed to run it for 6 years. Then we begged the Chinese to come back and run it. The port of Chinese Port Holding Authority. And now that is the preferred port for Afghan transit trade, because the distance from Gwadar to Kandahar is 900 kilometers. The distance from Karachi to the Afghan border is 1,800 kilometers. And even the Americans, when they were in Afghanistan, they wanted the Gwadar port for the transshipment of the NATO troops. And the Central Asians, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, they're all saying Gwadar is a destination. So I think that Gwadar port is now taking off. And because of that, the situation in Gwadar itself is becoming better for the people, because that was a neglected part of Pakistan with not clean drinking water, with no electricity. The electricity for Gwadar comes from Iran, by the way. We get 100 megawatts of electricity every day from Iran. 74 megawatts is for Gwadar. But now we are building a 300 megawatt power plant. The lady from Japan, Ohio gozaimasu. You mentioned about being the bridge builder. I just want to conclude at today's session that 50 years ago, President Nixon went on the most important foreign trip of any American president after World War II, which changed the global balance of power. It was a trip to China. And that trip was made possible by my country, Pakistan, because we were the bridge between the United States and China. And Dr. Henry Kissinger flew on a secret visit on 8th of July, 1971 on a PIA, Pakistan plane, to Beijing and met Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai and change the course of history. And last year, I was at a panel together with Dr. Kissinger, organized by the Chinese. I was representing Pakistan. He was speaking on his own. And there were Chinese leaders also. And he appreciated the role of Pakistan. So we'd like to play that role of a bridge builder still between Beijing and Washington. And I think Pakistan is positioned to play that role. So I think bridge building is very important. And 40 years ago, when I was a student in Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service, what we are hearing about China, we heard about Japan. They said Japan is the enemy, and the Japanese have taken over. And there was even a cover story, I remember, on Time magazine. Did Japan win World War II? And also one of the reasons, I'm sorry to say, was because both Japan and China are Asian countries. And I think there's more. It's also driven partly by the racial aspect also. Thank you so much.
Let me just say that Ms. Fiorina is now holding my notebook, which means that that's like the gavel. So I yield the concluding remarks to Ms. Fiorina.
So let me start with the gentlewoman's comment from Japan. We cannot ask, in my judgment, we cannot ask countries to choose between the US and China. China is a fact of life. We cannot ask them to choose. However, we, the US, must be crystal clear about our interests and our expectations, and some of those hit very close to home in Japan and will make Japan uncomfortable. For example, China cannot be permitted to dominate the East China Sea, period. And politicians of both parties in the US have been unclear and timid, and it has created confusion and mischief, just as, for example, in my humble opinion, we were unclear and timid with regard to Ukraine, and the consequences are now clear. We also must be equally clear that China cannot take Taiwan over, period. It is not in our interests, it is not in the world's interests, and we have to be crystal clear about that, or we will have unintended war, as Prime Minister Rudd suggested, because the Chinese have been very clear. The Chinese have been very clear for 40 plus years that they consider Taiwan theirs, and we have seen what they are prepared to do based on what they have done with Hong Kong. We cannot permit that to happen, and we must be clear. And that will put Japan in an uncomfortable position, obviously. In terms of Power Africa, it's such a great example of what's possible. And what I would encourage you to do, and perhaps A-Data can do this as well, I think the more understanding of that model that exists, the more publicity of that model that exists, the more encouragement of that model in the government and in the industrial community in this country, the better. It's a great example, and we need to do more and more and more, but we have to systematize it. With regard to the gentleman's question on free trade, and I think that question has hovered over this entire panel, yes, there are difficulties with free trade, without a doubt. There are abuses of free trade. There are countries that we lift up as a result of free trade that then, in the gentleman's words, turn against us in terms of their system of government, and yet the data is inescapable. Free trade has been a good for the world. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean there aren't fallbacks, but free trade has lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. It has given opportunity to millions, billions of people, and it does make the world more interdependent, and interdependence means people think a little longer before they shoot. They may shoot eventually, but they think a little longer, and the talk goes on a little longer. So interdependence is a good, as is lifting people out of poverty. And I want to end with the gentleman's plea. Because after all, as the provost suggested in her opening remarks, this is the cradle of democracy. This university, this city, here is where the world's first representative democracy was forged. And we are, in fact, now questioning Some people are questioning, well, authoritarian governments such as China are so clear, they're so consistent, they're so strategic, they can produce results, and we don't always do that so well. Yes, yes, and yes. However, I think the data is also crystal clear, not just in the last 5 years or the last 10 years, but in the last hundreds of years. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is the way of the world. And that is true in China just as it is anywhere else. Second, I think it is crystal clear, the data makes it clear, that a decentralization of power leads to an abundance of opportunity. And where you have entrepreneurship, opportunity, you get invention and innovation. And invention and innovation lift people's lives. And finally, I think the data is equally clear that without a foundation of rule of law and protection of individual rights and accountability for government, as well as transparency, that over time, more damage is done than good. And so I think there's a very powerful case for democracy that the data suggests over time. I think there's an equally powerful case for free trade that the data suggests over time. And my hope is that the United States, not just through its political actors, but through its academic institutions, through its citizens, through civil society, that the United States will continue to be a powerful, effective advocate for democracy and democratic ideals and free trade and the opportunity that every individual in the world ought to have access to. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for the panel.
Very good.
Thank you.
And
I
very
hope
helpful.
that's whet everybody's appetite for the
Yes,
next
yes.
2 days
Very
of
good.
proceedings. So thank you.
Finale.